No one in the valley believed a rusted-out drilling rig could bring a county water authority to its knees. The men who ran that authority thought the old farmer had already lost. His land was flagged for seizure, his water rights disputed, and his 40 acres sat one signature away from being folded into somebody else's pipeline easement. And the only thing standing between him and losing everything his father had drilled, dug, and bled for was a piece of junk machinery that the entire auction lot had laughed at. But when that rusted rig cracked open in his barn, it did not give up scrap metal. It gave up a secret the water authority had spent 40 years hoping no one would ever find. And what they did not know, what none of them could have known standing in that gravel lot mocking an old man in a canvas coat, was that their own paperwork would be the very thing that buried them. For 70 years. That secret had sat sealed inside a welded box, riding along on a machine that changed hands rusted in storage yards. And finally landed on an auction table with a tag that called it worthless, never once suspecting that the one man in the county who could actually read what it meant would be the same man the water authority was trying to push off his own land. This is the story of Ezra Whitlock, a well, and the piece of paper that outlived every man who ever tried to bury it. The story begins on a gray October morning in the Ozark foothills, at a county public works surplus auction held twice a year behind the highway maintenance barn. Frost still sat white on the chain-link fence, and the smell of diesel and wet gravel hung low over rows of retired road graders, decommissioned pump trucks, and crates of scavenged pipe fittings. Somewhere past the tree line, a chainsaw idled and quit, as though even the machines waking up that morning weren't entirely sure they wanted to. Ezra Whitlock arrived a little after 7, alone, in a truck that had crossed 200,000 miles sometime the previous spring. He was 71 years old, a widower for 6 of those years, and the sole remaining name on the deed to a 40-acre hill farm that his father had cleared by hand in 1949, the same year the county courthouse still had a hitching post out front. He did not look to anyone watching like a man who had come to buy anything worth owning. His canvas coat had been patched at both elbows, the stitching done by his own hand and none too fine. His boots were the same pair he'd worn to his wife's funeral, resoled twice since. He carried no clipboard, no assistant. No plan that anyone could see. Only a small waterproof folder tucked under one arm and a coffee can in the truck bed with exactly $410 folded inside it. Money he had scraped together from the last of his walnut harvest and a hog he'd sold 2 weeks earlier at a price that still stung to think about. He had debated, more than once that week, whether to come at all. Every dollar in that coffee can was a dollar he might need for a lawyer he couldn't yet afford. But there was a habit in him worn in over 40 years of hard seasons. Of never quite trusting that a problem was as unsolvable as it first appeared. And something about the surplus auction, about the idea of machinery other men had already given up on, had been pulling at him since he'd seen the county's notice posted in the feed store window. His son had offered, more than once over the phone from 3 states away, to send money for a proper attorney, someone with a downtown office and a retainer fee that would have made Ezra wince. Ezra had thanked him and declined every time. It wasn't pride exactly, or not only pride. It was the plain fact that he had spent his whole life solving problems with his own 2 hands before ever reaching for someone else's, and at 71. In the last real fight he expected to have over the only home he'd ever known, he wasn't about to change that now. This was not an ordinary equipment sale. It was a liquidation auction. And buried among the graders and mowers were several lots the county had quietly seized or reclaimed. Machinery pulled off properties where landowners had fallen behind on assessments, or where old easement disputes had ended in forfeiture one way or another in the county's favor. Ezra's own name had appeared more than once that year, on paperwork not so different from what had put these machines here. He knew that. He had come anyway, because a man who stops walking into rooms that make him uncomfortable is a man who has already decided how the story ends. At the folding table near the gate, a clerk from the Ridgemont Regional Water Authority sat behind a stack of manila folders, each one labeled with a parcel number, an overdue balance, or both. One of those folders, thin, recent, and marked with a red tab, belonged to Ezra's own farm. It sat near the top of the stack, not 2 feet from where he signed in for his bidder number, close enough that he could have reached out and turned it over to read his own name upside down if he'd wanted to. He didn't. He signed his card, took his number, and kept his eyes forward. The man running that table was Dale Pruitt, the authority's regional supervisor, a man in his 50s with a Carhartt jacket too clean for actual fieldwork, and a way of speaking to landowners that made every sentence sound like it had already been reviewed by legal. He had spent the better part of his career turning old rural easements into new pipeline right-of-ways, and he had learned, over the years, that most people folded the moment official-looking paper landed on their kitchen table. Pruitt recognized Ezra the moment he stepped up to sign his card, and he did not lower his voice when he spoke. "Man about to lose his water rights," Pruitt said, loud enough for the men behind Ezra to hear, "ought to be saving what little he's got for a lawyer, not spending it on scrap iron he can't even haul home. A ripple of laughter moved through the small crowd gathering near the gate. A few men turned to look Ezra over the way people look at something they've already decided isn't worth their attention. To them, he was simply an old man about to be picked apart by a system that had already made up its mind, and now, apparently, foolish enough to throw good money after bad in the middle of it. Ezra said nothing. He folded his bidder card once, slid it into his coat pocket alongside the waterproof folder, and walked toward the far end of the lot, where the least desirable machinery sat waiting to be forgotten. The first two rows held equipment dressed up to look better than it was, repainted graders with fresh decals, mowers with new tires bolted on to distract from tired engines, everything arranged so a buyer's eye would land on shine before it landed on substance. Ezra walked past all of it without breaking stride, hands clasped loosely behind his back the way he walked a fence line checking for downed wire. He had learned decades earlier that paint told you what a seller wanted you to believe and nothing more. He had learned this the hard way, working 3 winters in his 20s at a machinery repair shop 2 counties over, back when the farm couldn't support him and his young family through the cold months, and pride had to take a backseat to a mortgage payment. It wasn't glamorous work. It was cold hands and stripped bolts, and long afternoons flat on his back under other men's mistakes, learning by lamplight how a transmission failed differently than it looked like it failed, how a cracked casting could hide behind a perfectly good coat of paint. How the men who wrote up an equipment tag for resale were more often than any of them wanted to admit guessing. That job hadn't paid much. But it had given him something no amount of farming alone ever could, an eye for the difference between a machine that was broken and a machine that had simply been misjudged. And a stubborn refusal to take another man's verdict on a piece of iron without checking it himself first. Word of that reputation had followed him, quietly, for years afterward. Neighbors still called him sometimes when a hay baler jammed mid-harvest or a well pump went silent at the worst possible hour, and Ezra would drive over with a toolbox and a flashlight, and more often than not, find the actual problem within 20 minutes of arriving. He had never charged them more than the cost of parts. It wasn't a business. It was simply the only language he'd ever been fluent in besides farming itself. It was near the back fence, past a row of scrapped fence post drivers and a stack of culvert pipe gone orange with rust, that he stopped at lot 118. The tag zip-tied to its frame read, "Cable tool well rig and ON functional salvage only." It had been pulled, according to the small print beneath the warning, from a decommissioned homestead the authority had absorbed the year before under an old improvement lien. One more line in a long list of small farms that had, over the decades, quietly become someone else's paperwork. The rig itself was a squat, iron-boned relic, taller than a man and twice as wide. The kind of percussion drilling unit farmers once used to punch water wells by hand-cranked cable long before rotary rigs and diesel power made the whole design obsolete. Its main mast was bent at an angle that made it look, at a glance, like it had been dropped from the back of a flatbed truck and left where it landed. Rust had eaten clean through the housing around the winch, leaving a lace-like pattern of holes where solid steel used to be. A control box on its side hung half off its mounting bolts, welded shut at some point in its life by someone who had clearly given up trying to fix whatever was wrong inside it, and decided sealing it away was easier than solving it. A salvage dealer walking past it snorted, and said the whole rig probably wasn't worth the diesel it'd take to drag it off the lot. A younger man nearby agreed, adding with a laugh that the county was probably just glad to have it gone, one less eyesore cluttering up a storage yard somewhere. Prout, standing near enough to hear, allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. In his mind, lot 118 was dead iron, plain and simple, and the old farmer drifting toward it was about to make himself the morning's entertainment for anyone still hanging around the coffee table. Ezra ignored all of it. He knelt on the cold gravel, feeling it bite through the knee of his trousers, pulled a penlight from his coat, and shined it into the gearing beneath the rig's mast. He ran his palm along a section of cable drum, feeling for the telltale groove of a drum that had seen real use versus one that had simply sat and corroded. He checked the pitch of a worn gear tooth with his thumbnail the way another man might check the edge of a knife, and opened the small waterproof folder he'd carried since morning. It was not a bank statement. It was not a legal filing. It was a logbook, 30 years of handwritten notes on drilling rigs, well casings, pump failures, and machinery quirks that Ezra had kept since his repair shop years, the pages filled with cramped pencil diagrams and dates and part numbers. The kind of private technical record that meant nothing to anyone, except a man who had spent half his life underneath machines exactly like this one. He turned to a page near the middle, one gone soft and yellow at the corner from being handled in barns and equipment sheds for 3 decades, and studied it beside the rig in front of him, his lips moving slightly as he cross-referenced a measurement. A man nearby laughed and asked if he was taking notes for a funeral. Ezra didn't answer. He measured the gap on the mast's pivot joint with a folding steel rule, wrote 2 numbers into the logbook in a small, careful hand, and moved to the welded control box. He tapped it once with his knuckle, Listen to the hollow, uneven sound it gave back, not the flat ring of solid metal, but something softer, something that suggested space where there shouldn't have been any, and closed the folder. Whatever he had just confirmed, he kept to himself, tucking the folder back inside his coat and standing slowly, one hand braced against his knee, the way a man stands when the cold has settled into joints that have earned the right to complain. At 9:30, the auctioneer's voice cracked over a cheap PA system mounted to a folding stand, and the sale began in earnest. The good machinery moved first, a nearly new grader, a set of mowing decks, a service truck with low miles, and money changed hands quickly among dealers who already knew exactly what they'd come to buy and how much they were willing to spend before the first card ever went up. The crowd pressed close during those early lots, breath fogging in the cold morning air, boots shuffling on frozen gravel. Ezra stood at the back of the crowd through all of it, hands in his coat pockets, bitter card untouched, watching the way a man watches weather, rolling impatient, unhurried, waiting for the moment that actually mattered to him. By the time the auctioneer worked his way toward the back rows, most of the serious money had already been spent. The crowd had thinned considerably, dealers drifting toward the coffee urn near the gate, satisfied with what they'd already loaded onto trailers. When Lot 118 finally rolled forward on a flatbed trailer, pulled by a tractor with a smoking exhaust, only a scattering of onlookers remained to see it. The auctioneer read the county's own description aloud, flat and dismissive, the way a man reads a sentence he doesn't expect anyone to care about. Non-functional salvage only, sold as is, no warranty expressed or implied. The opening bid was set at $200. Nobody moved. He dropped it to $150, then to $100, then to $60, and the rig sat there in the cold like something nobody in the lot wanted to be seen wanting. Its bent mast catching the gray morning light at an angle that made it look almost apologetic for taking up space. Finally, the same salvage dealer who'd mocked it earlier raised two fingers, a bid of $40, clearly meant only to strip it for scrap iron and be done with it before lunch. That was when Ezra raised his card. $60, he said, his voice carrying further than his quiet manner suggested it would. Heads turned. A few of the men who drifted toward the coffee table wandered back to see what the commotion was. Pruitt, standing near the folding table, frowned and crossed his arms, his earlier amusement curdling into something closer to irritation. The salvage dealer glanced over, more annoyed than worried, and bumped it to $70, clearly assuming the old man would fold the moment real money got involved. Ezra answered with $90. The dealer pushed to $110, his patience visibly thinning. Ezra, without raising his voice, without so much as glancing at the men watching him, answered with $140. A murmur moved through the small crowd. This was no longer a joke about an old fool wasting his last dollars. It had become, without anyone quite deciding it should, the most interesting thing happening in the yard that morning. The dealer hesitated. He looked at the crumpled iron in front of him, did the math in his head on what it would actually fetch broken down for scrap after hauling costs, and shook his head, lowering his card for good. The auctioneer called for another bid, scanned the thinning crowd, found none, and brought the hammer down with a crack that seemed unnaturally loud in the cold air. For $140, Ezra Whitlock became the owner of a piece of machinery that the county's own paperwork had declared worthless. Pruitt walked over with the same cold smile he'd worn at the gate that morning, the kind of smile that never quite reached the eyes above it. He offered a congratulations that sounded more like a warning than reminded Ezra, loudly enough for the men nearby to hear. As though performing for an audience, that a broken-down well rig wasn't going to change a single date on the authority's improvement lien, and that his 40 acres were still on schedule for review in 6 weeks' time, whether he'd bought a truckload of rust or not. Ezra folded his receipt, tucked it into the same waterproof folder as his logbook, and said only in a voice that gave nothing away that he intended to have the rig hauled home before the hour was out. He did not look at Pruitt again. He walked back toward his truck, already thinking through the logistics of a tow chain and a neighbor's flatbed. The cold morning behind him settling into the kind of quiet satisfaction a man allows himself only when he's fairly certain he's the only one in the yard who actually understands what just happened. That evening, after the sun dropped behind the ridgeline and the temperature in the valley fell hard enough to fog the windows of the farmhouse, Ezra backed the rig into the old equipment shed behind his barn. The same building his father had built to house exactly this kind of machinery 2 generations earlier back, when a family farm still needed its own well rig rather than relying on a county utility for anything. The shed smelled the way it always had: old motor oil, cedar shavings, the faint mineral tang of well water that never quite washed out of the concrete floor. He hung a work light from a rafter nail his father had driven decades before, laid out a canvas drop cloth, and began taking the rig apart piece by piece: winch housing, mast, pivot, cable, drum, and finally the welded control box that no one at the auction had bothered to ask about, let alone open. He worked with the patience of a man who understood that machines, like people, rarely broke the way you first assumed, and that a verdict written on a tag by someone who'd spent 30 seconds looking at a thing was rarely the whole story, bolt by bolt. The mast pivot came apart clean exactly as his notes had predicted out in the auction yard. Worn at the joint, not bent beyond repair, the kind of damage a careless tow chain or a rough forklift could produce far more easily than any real structural failure ever could. The story the county had used to write the rig off as scrap metal was, just as he'd suspected, kneeling on that cold gravel, wrong from the start. The welded control box took longer, and his hands ached by the time he finally had it positioned right under the light. He worked a cutting wheel carefully along the old weld bead, sparks scattering across the drop cloth in small orange arcs, taking his time so as not to damage whatever sat inside, though at that point he still had no real idea what, if anything, he expected to find. When the housing finally cracked open under gentle pressure from a flathead screwdriver, he found inside not the wiring or burned-out motor he'd half expected, but a second smaller compartment, a false floor someone had built into the box decades earlier. Welded and sealed with a strip of oiled leather gone stiff, with age clearly meant to keep out moisture for as long as possible. Underneath it sat a brass data plate, a folded set of onion skin carbon papers gone brittle at the creases, and a small logbook of the rig's own, water-stained at the corners but still legible under the swinging work light. The brass plate carried a manufacturer's serial number and a stamped date, 1951. The carbon papers, when he unfolded them with the careful patience of a man handling something he suspected mattered more than he yet understood, turned out to be a well-completion certificate. Issued by the county surveyor's office that same year for a homestead, well drilled on what the paperwork called Parcel 14. The very parcel later, absorbed through decades of quiet consolidation, into what the Ridgemont Regional Water Authority now claimed. Under a 1970s handshake agreement, no one had ever properly filed with the county as the origin point of their pipeline easement. Ezra sat back on an overturned feed bucket and read the certificate twice under the swinging light, his breath visible in the cold shed air. The barn cats somewhere behind him settling into the hayloft for the night as though nothing in the world had changed. Because if the well those papers described was the same well feeding the spring on the eastern edge of his own property, and everything in his father's old boundary notes, the ones he'd inherited in a cigar box after the funeral, and never had reason to study closely, told him it was, then the water right the authority had been using for years to justify their claim on his land, did not originate with them at all. It originated with a homestead well drilled a full 20 years before their easement agreement ever existed on paper, under a state legal doctrine that gave older, properly recorded water claims priority over anything filed later, regardless of how many decades a utility had simply assumed otherwise. In other words, if the paper trembling slightly in his hands was what he believed it to be, the authority's entire legal foundation for taking any part of his land was sitting on a right they had never actually possessed in the first place. He did not sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table, with the shed's work light traded for the warmer glow of the lamp. His wife had always kept by the window reading the carbon papers a third time, then a fourth comparing serial numbers against his own father's handwritten farm ledger. Matching dates against a boundary description that lined up line for line, fence for fence, post with the eastern property line his father had walked him along as a boy of 9. Teaching him where their land ended and the neighboring homestead, long since folded into the authority's holdings, had once begun. By sunrise, with the coffee gone cold beside him and the first gray light coming up over the ridge, Ezra Whitlock understood something the Ridgemont Regional Water Authority had spent 4 decades hoping no one would ever dig up. Quite literally out of a welded box, inside a piece of machinery they themselves had tagged as worthless and sold for less than the price of a week's groceries. If a piece of junk machinery like this could hold the one document that changes everything, drop a comment below and tell us. Do you think Ezra's rig will be enough to stop the authority, or is this fight just getting started? Hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens when Ridgemont finds out what's sitting in that barn. News that Ezra had pulled documents from the old rig did not stay quiet for long. Within a week, word had reached the county courthouse, carried, Ezra suspected, though he could never prove it, by the same clerk who had sat 2 feet from his file at the auction gate that morning and likely mentioned it to the wrong person over lunch. In a town small enough that the feed store still doubled as the local switchboard for gossip, some things simply couldn't stay contained. Pruitt arrived at the farm on a Thursday morning with 2 authority trucks and a man in a gray suit Ezra had never seen before, carrying a folder of his own and a manner that suggested he billed by the hour. They did not knock. They walked the yard as though it already belonged to them, boots crossing ground that Ezra's father had walked for 30 years before either of these men had been born, and Pruitt handed Ezra a fresh notice printed on authority letterhead, stating that any equipment discovered to be connected to the parcel's disputed water infrastructure could be seized pending review, including the notice specified in a line that made Ezra's jaw tighten. The drilling rig recently purchased at public auction. It was, Ezra understood immediately, not really about the rig at all. It was about what the rig had produced. If the authority could take the machine before Ezra filed the documents anywhere official, the carbon papers inside, it would have no context, no chain of custody. Nothing to anchor them credibly to the parcel they described. A technicality perhaps, but the kind of technicality a good attorney could stretch into reasonable doubt for months, maybe years, while the authorities' construction crews moved ahead regardless. Ezra did not raise his voice. He did not block the drive, though every instinct in him wanted to plant himself squarely between the trucks and the shed. He understood the way a man who has spent a lifetime watching institutions operate understands. That anger would only hand Prout the story he wanted to tell later, of an old farmer who couldn't accept the county's authority, who made things difficult, who gave them just cause to move faster and harder than they otherwise might have. Instead, Ezra stood on his porch with a small notebook of his own, and wrote down the license plate of each truck, the time they arrived, the names printed on the notice, and the badge number of the man in the gray suit, who turned out to be an authority-contracted attorney rather than any kind of law enforcement despite how he carried himself. His hand shook slightly as he wrote, though not from fear. He had learned in 30 years of farm bookkeeping that a record kept in the moment, ink still wet, held up in ways a memory recalled a month later in a courtroom simply could not. What Prout's crew did not find, because Ezra had moved it the night before under cover of darkness to a safe deposit box at the credit union in town, along with photocopies left with Marion Cobb's office for good measure, was the brass plate and the carbon papers themselves. The rig they hauled away that morning was, by then, an empty shell, its secret already extracted, copied, and sealed somewhere no authority truck could reach, no matter how much paperwork they waved. As the flatbed pulled the rig down the gravel drive, kicking up dust that hung in the cold morning air long after the trucks had turned onto the county road, Prout leaned toward Ezra one last time, and told him quietly enough that only the two of them could hear it. That he should have spent his auction money on a lawyer, instead of trying to outsmart people who wrote the rules for a living. Ezra only watched the truck disappear down the road, then turned and walked back inside, past the empty space in the shed where the rig had sat that morning, to make a phone call of his own. That afternoon, still running on no sleep and 2 cups of lukewarm coffee, Ezra drove into town and sat across a cluttered desk from Marion Cobb, a county legal aid attorney in her 40s who had spent most of her career on farm foreclosure cases, and knew better than most people in that courthouse how often paperwork was the only weapon a family like the Whitlocks had left against an institution with a budget line for lawyers. At first, she assumed it was another standard lien dispute, the kind she'd seen a dozen times that year alone, an old family farm caught between an unpaid assessment and a utility eager to expand its footprint into land that had never technically been offered for sale. She'd heard versions of this story so many times that she could usually predict the ending before the farmer finished explaining the beginning. But when Ezra laid the certified copies of the carbon papers across her desk, alongside his father's original boundary ledger and a county plat map from the same era, still smelling faintly of the cedar shed they'd spent 70 years in, her expression changed in a way Ezra noticed immediately. She asked to see the well completion certificate again, then a third time, holding it up to the window light as though checking for a watermark. Then she pulled the current authority easement filing from the county archive on her computer and set it beside Ezra's 1951 documents, comparing parcel numbers line by line, her pen tapping an increasingly rapid rhythm against the desk. The two didn't just overlap. The authority's own filing, she pointed out, quietly conceded, in a footnote likely no one had expected a farmer to ever read closely. Buried on the 4th page of a document few people outside the authority's own legal department had ever bothered to pull, that the pipeline easement they'd relied on since the 1970s had been established through what the filing itself called an unrecorded prior arrangement with the previous landowner. In water law, she explained, leaning back in her chair with the first real smile Ezra had seen from anyone in weeks, an unrecorded arrangement carried far less legal weight than a properly filed senior water right. And Ezra now held documented proof of exactly that kind of senior right, drilled, certified, and filed with the county surveyor's office a full 20 years before the authorities' claim ever existed on paper at all. Cobb filed for an emergency injunction the following morning, halting both the equipment seizure and the pending improvement lien review until a formal hearing could take place, and warned Ezra, not unkindly, that the authority would not go down without making the fight as expensive and exhausting as they possibly could. Ezra told her he'd expected nothing less, and that he had time. What he didn't have, he said quietly, was land he was willing to lose without a fight. The hearing was held 3 weeks later in the county courthouse, in a room too small for the number of people who showed up to watch it. Neighbors who'd farmed alongside Ezra for decades filled the back rows, several of them in their good church clothes as though the occasion demanded it. A few reporters from the regional paper sat near the aisle, notebooks already open. Prout sat at the front table beside the authority's attorney, a folder of his own laid out in front of him, his expression carrying the same cold confidence it had worn in the surplus yard weeks before. Though Ezra thought watching him from across the aisle, that it looked a shade more brittle than it had that October morning. The authority's attorney opened by arguing that regardless of any old documents, a homeowner might have dug up Ezra still owed the disputed improvement assessment in full, and that the authority retained every right to establish infrastructure access across the parcel under its long-standing 1970s arrangement. An arrangement he characterized as customary and well understood by everyone involved at the time. Cobb rose and piece by piece laid the county's own filings against Ezra's 1951 well certificate, projecting both onto a screen at the front of the room so the judge could follow along line by line. She walked the room through the boundary description, matched carefully against the current county plat map, her voice steady and unhurried. She called the county surveyor's office clerk to the stand, who confirmed under oath somewhat reluctantly that the parcel numbers referenced in the 1951 certificate matched a well still active on Ezra's land to this day, the same spring that fed his cattle pond that his father had shown him as a boy. That had never once run dry, even in the driest years anyone in the room could remember. Then she called the mechanic Ezra had brought in to examine the rig before it was seized, a man named Roy Talbert who had spent 30 years working cable tool and rotary drilling equipment across 3 counties and had, as it happened, apprenticed under the very same repair shop where Ezra had once worked. Talbert testified that the rig's data plate and serial number matched period drilling equipment records held in the state archive, confirming beyond reasonable dispute that the machine, and by extension the well it had drilled, dated exactly to the year printed on the brass plate. He added, almost as an aside that landed harder than anything else said that morning, that in 30 years he'd rarely seen county paperwork this clean. The authority's attorney objected repeatedly, each objection sustained less often than the last. Prout leaned over more than once to whisper corrections his own attorney didn't seem especially eager to use, his composure visibly fraying as the morning wore on. But the deeper the hearing went, the more the authority's case sounded less like a legal claim built on solid ground and more like an old convenient arrangement that had never been properly filed, propped up for 40 years, by nothing more than the quiet assumption that no one would ever bother to check. Cobb's closing question to the room was simple, delivered without theatrics, in the same steady voice she'd used all morning. Should a public utility be allowed to build an entire claim on land rights on an agreement it never once bothered to record with the county, and then move to seize property from a family whose own water right had been properly filed decades earlier? The very moment that family found the proof sitting in a piece of junk machinery the authority itself had sold them, the room went quiet enough that Ezra could hear the old radiator ticking against the far wall. Even Prout, for the first time all morning, said nothing at all. The judge did not rule that day. It took 11 days during which Ezra kept the farm running the way he always had, feeding cattle before sunrise, mending fence, in the cold, checking on the spring that had, without his ever fully realizing it, been quietly protecting his family's claim to this land for 75 years before he ever needed it to. He tried, during those 11 days, not to think too hard about what would happen if the ruling went the other way. It was easier most mornings to simply do the next chore in front of him and let the waiting take care of itself. When the ruling finally came, delivered on a Tuesday afternoon in a letter Cobb read aloud to him over the phone while he stood in his kitchen with one hand braced against the counter, it was thorough, and it did not leave much room for argument. The court found that the authority's pipeline easement, resting on nothing more than an unrecorded 1970s arrangement, could not supersede a properly documented senior water right established, filed, and certified in 1951. The improvement lien tied to that disputed easement was voided in full, effective immediately. The authority was ordered to return the drilling rig without delay, cover the legal costs of the emergency injunction, and formally withdraw any and all claims on Ezra's 40 acres, in writing, within 30 days. It was, in the plainest terms available to the court, a complete reversal of everything the authority had assumed for 4 decades it could simply take without ever being seriously questioned by the one family who actually held the older claim. A year on, the old cable tool rig sits under a linta behind Ezra's barn, not running. Its drilling days ended decades before he ever bought it, and he never had much use for restoring it beyond what dignity a little cleaning could give back to it, but stable enough to display. Its brass plate polished and mounted on the wall of his equipment shed beside his father's original 1951 well certificate, framed behind glass his grandson helped him cut to size one Saturday afternoon. The spring on the eastern edge of the property still runs the way it always has, feeding the same cattle pond his father dug by hand the summer before Ezra was born, indifferent to lawsuits and easements and 40 years of paperwork that had nearly forgotten it existed at all. The authority's pipeline, when it was finally built 2 years later, after a revised survey, ran a wide arc around Ezra's 40 acres instead of through them, a route neighbors liked to point out over coffee at the feed store. That cost considerably more to survey and lay than the one Prout had originally planned, and that Prout himself was transferred to a desk job in another county, Not long after the ruling came down, a fact nobody in town seemed especially sorry about. The people who had laughed at the auction gate that October morning tell the story differently now. Not as the tale of an old man wasting his last dollars on a pile of rusted iron, but as the story of a man who understood. Better than the institution trying to take his land, that some of the most important things are never where you expect to find them. Sometimes they're welded shut inside a piece of junk everyone else had already decided wasn't worth a second look. Waiting patiently in the cold for someone stubborn enough to kneel down and check. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a piece of land once a fight like this is finally over. Not celebration, exactly, just the sound of a place being allowed to go back to being simply itself. The cattle still need feeding at the same hour every morning. The fence still needs mending after every hard winter. Nothing about the daily work of the farm changed because of what happened in that courtroom, and maybe that's exactly the point. Ezra Whitlock never set out to expose 4 decades of loose paperwork inside a regional water authority, never imagined himself as the kind of man whose name would end up in a legal filing significant enough for a judge to spend 11 days deliberating over. He set out on a cold October morning to buy the cheapest working machine he could find at a public auction. Because that was what $140 could still buy a man determined enough to look past what everyone else in that yard had already decided wasn't worth a second glance. It's worth sitting with for a moment how close the whole thing came to never happening at all. If Ezra had walked past lot 118 the way every other buyer that morning did, if he'd trusted the tag instead of his own 30 years of quiet, hard-won expertise, if he'd let Pruitt's words at the gate talk him out of spending money he could barely spare on a machine everyone assured him was worthless. The line between an old farm lost to paperwork nobody bothered to double-check and an old farm saved by paperwork nobody expected to serve turned out to be thinner than anyone in that auction yard could have guessed. Thin enough to fit inside a welded steel box sealed shut and waiting for 70 years for someone to finally ask the right question. What do you think how many old family farms out there are sitting on documents just like this one right now, tucked away in a barn, a filing cabinet, or a welded shut control box, waiting for someone patient enough to go looking before it's too late? Tell us in the comments below. And if this story reminded you that the most valuable things in life are rarely the ones that look valuable at first glance, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like Ezra's.